have, and that this constant learning, new adaptation will enable people to still have jobs in the future. One of the reason I'm saying this is that one of the kind of the main fears that many people have, and this has come up in the podcast several times, is that once AI or autonomous vehicles or enough of these kinds of autonomous technologies come about, it'll make people completely redundant. It'll erase enough jobs that there will be this massive pool of people that won't have an opportunity to feed themselves, to clothe themselves, to attain the amount of money that they need to survive. So to me, it sounds like you're a little bit against the idea of a universal basic income. Is that correct? Or am I misreading?
Not necessarily, but when you have a look at universal basic incomes, for example, no one's really been able to prove that they work. We've had Finland, we've had Canada, we've had the US with Y Combinator. Basically, we've actually had UK and Scotland that have put them in. We've had Germany trial them. Most of the universal basic income schemes, basically, that have included anywhere from between sort of a couple of hundred people to kind of 10 to 20,000 people, have generally concluded that for about 30% of people, it actually had a meaningful difference, because all of a sudden having access to a universal basic income meant that they no longer had to scrimp and save and kind of worry about just how they were going to feed their families. Taking that worry away basically is absolutely important. And this is where, if you want to build people up and if you want to develop economies, the two things that you should invest in is education and healthcare. Because those drive everything else. When we have a look at education is one of the very few sort of things that actually has a cross-generational impact. If I'm educated as an individual, then my kids will more than likely be educated and they will get better paid jobs, and their kids basically will get better paid jobs, and it keeps feeding down the chain. But when you have a look at universal basic income, you can kind of argue that it works, but most of the schemes are paying people about 600 euros to about 1,100 sort of euros / dollars. And that's not really enough. There's also conversations about how you pay for these things. So, for example, if you have a look at South Korea, as well as California, basically we're doing robot taxes. So if you have one robot that takes one person's job and that person earned 50,000 euros, I'm going to tax them at the national rate. So I'll tax your company for that robot. But robots, for example, improve exponentially over time. So that one robot today can take one human job, but in 5 years' time, it's taking 100 jobs. Are you going to tax it at the same rate? And then, as we become more of a digital economy, as we become more software centric, I can just move my robots to the Bahamas, and tough. Tough if you're Germany, because they've got some nice tax breaks for my robots over there. So when you go and have conversations, basically with G20 leaders and finance ministers, and I have lots of these conversations, and they're exciting, as you can tell. UBI basically is something that's always slated as a solution. We haven't really found the model basically that works yet, but we found a promising model. We found ways to pay for it, but companies are fantastic at figuring out ways around having to pay for stuff. Starbucks in the UK, Amazon in the UK, they paid about $1 million in tax. They're taking in billions in revenues. Come on, you don't think I can move my robots or my AIs basically to a different country, or use a different vehicle? And it's this, when you start having a look at this, Japan, about 2 years ago, the Japanese finance minister actually said, when it comes to the future of jobs, bearing in mind that we see so much automation coming through, different stats say anywhere between 30 to 50% of jobs can be fully automated, and then more jobs can be partially automated. The Japanese finance minister at the time actually said, maybe we should actually stop, rethink capitalism and actually not have capitalism. Maybe we should get rid of money. It's like that Star Trek, the Star Trek vision, where Captain Kirk goes, we don't have money. Everyone works for the benefit of humankind and exploration. And when you actually, that kind of, to me, basically makes actually a lot of sense. But when you go and have a conversation basically with, the World Economic Forum, the leaders at Davos, and say, you're worth $11.5 trillion as a bunch of rich dudes and a couple of rich women,
Yeah.
etc. Let's face it, inequality. We're thinking about, fundamentally changing how capitalism works. They'll go, yeah, you know what, it's absolutely needed. And I've seen this at Davos, where they go, absolutely, global inequality, wealth inequality, poverty, automation of jobs and workforce. We absolutely should fix that. And then in the words of, New York Times journalists, Guardian journalists, and everything else, they talk a great game, but they do bugger all, when you look at the policies on the ground. And I suppose basically just sort of throwing this little snippet in there, there was a Rice University recently did a survey across 100 years, and they wanted to see whether or not there was a link to education and earnings, whether there was actually a real link to education and earnings. And they found that over 100 years, everything was in lockstep. If you had a good education, you would earn more. If you didn't have a good education, you'd earn less. And it was for every country, every demographic, rich, poor, every sort of ethnicity. It didn't matter how you looked at the data, there was this massive link between education and earnings. And it's going to be the same in the future. If you are adaptable, if you can see change coming and you're proactive, then you have the right economic system and tax system and government systems in place that allow you to move from one career to another career. So for example, when you look at Singapore with a future skills program, they will say, if you're making an accountant redundant, but you're now moving that person to become a data scientist, we'll give you a tax break. And we'll give you tax breaks as an individual to learn how to become a data scientist. This is where, when we try to solve the future of jobs and work, it's not one thing. I can't just say retrain yourself. You've got to have the right cultural, the right economic systems, the right societal systems in place. Because if you're an accountant, you can imagine an accountant taking a data scientist course, going to Microsoft as a 40, 50-year-old and saying, I'm a data scientist level 101 now. Microsoft will just go, that's great, but we hired a graduate. Awesome on you, though. Good luck somewhere. So this is where, in order for us all to benefit, this stuff fundamentally got to be rethought. And there are governments that are now starting to do that. But it's like pulling it does, certainly to me, because I'm involved in this, it feels like you're dragging a horse to water, and then you're shoving its head in the water forcibly, trying to get it to actually do something and drink. And we are making progress.
But I would say it's also it's not just the horses facing the water. You also have people, the vested interests, like the people that you mentioned at Davos, pulling on that horse's reins to get it out of the water, right?
Absolutely. I mean, if you have a look at the vast majority of the world's billionaires, you can quite easily argue that a lot of their wealth is actually built on the back of low-cost labor.
Sure.
Yeah, let alone robots and all that kind of stuff. Sure. And you can say that's a sort of divisive argument or whatever it happens to be, and you can slice and dice all these arguments any which way you like. But it's generally the fact. Increasingly, when you have a look at, as I say, I'm sort of writing this trends codex at the minute, and as I'm sort of going through mega trend statistics, the numbers are insane. They just make your head spin. And as I say, when it comes to this kind of inequality or basically this societal change that we're increasingly going through, we call it Industry 4, where everybody sort of looks to the future and goes, oh, we're all going to be automated. There will be new jobs coming through. So I'll give you a really fast example. So if you step back 5-6 years ago, if I wanted to create a deep fake, I'd have to work for Stanford University. I'd have to be an expert in artificial intelligence and deep learning, typically, maybe a bit of machine learning. I'd generally be paid about $1 to $1.5 million, and you'd need about 5 to 10 people like me to create a really, really bad deep fake. Now I can download a Chinese app like Zhao. I can scan my face with the camera, or even I can just take a selfie, or I can use a photo off Facebook, and I can turn myself into a deep fake, and I can insert myself into a Leonardo DiCaprio movie. You've got platforms like Reface as well. That doesn't cost me anything, and it doesn't really cost me any of my time, just a photo, and I can embed myself in there. So on the one hand, the reason why I'm telling this story is it kind of overlaps with social media and it overlaps with synthetic content. So the ability to create synthetic content of all forms is becoming simple. It's becoming free.
Yeah.
It's becoming democratized. The creative industry itself employs 235 million people, and it's worth about $6 trillion of GDP. Recently, a bunch of Russians used an artificial intelligence to design logos for customers, and the customers had no idea it was an AI that was designing the logos, and they loved them, etc. So it's all areas when we talk about synthetic content. But now we're looking for people who can help us create startups, businesses, and different skills, basically, to identify deep fakes.
Right.
So that's where, if you were in the creative industry, I'm saying we've got stuff to automate you. But on the other hand, you can now become a deepfake analyst, for example. So there are always going to be new jobs coming through. But it comes back to this central part of, as an individual, you've got to be able to adapt, and you've got to be in the right environment and have the right support systems in place to help you move from being a logo artist to a deepfake analyst, that kind of stuff.
Right.
And it's not impossible. Some things are difficult, some things are easier, but you've got to have the right societal support structures in place. And again, a lot of that is missing. There's this kind of chasm. In today's world, if you're a logo designer, you'd just be made redundant, and you'd go and try and find another job being a logo designer for a company that doesn't use an AI.
Yeah.
That's the cycle that we're trying to break.